The first little carton of milk at a very low price, but after that it gets bad and then it gets up to 275–300%. Mexico goes all out to grow milk production. U.S. complaints about protectionist Canadian dairy policy. Hypocritical report argues $3.2 billion. That's how much Canada just pocketed without a handshake, without a press conference, by replacing the United States in Mexico's dairy imports. And here's the twist. This didn't happen with a bang. It happened in silence. Mexico, once one of the top buyers of American milk, has quietly pulled the plug. Gone are the gallons that once flowed from Wisconsin and Ohio into Guadalajara and Mexico City. Instead, Canada is stepping in with cleaner supply chains, clearer standards, and something Washington seems to be losing fast. For U.S. dairy farmers already struggling with tariffs, drought, and rising costs, this isn't just bad news, it's a gut punch. Why did Mexico, America's closest neighbor and trading partner, ditch U.S. milk? And why Canada? Is this just a temporary realignment? Or the start of a deeper shift in who the region trusts to feed its people? And more importantly, is this how a superpower loses its seat at the agricultural table without even realizing it's gone? Let's break it down. America's dairy exports once ruled global markets. Throughout 2023, Mexico alone accounted for $2.32 billion in U.S. dairy sales, representing about 1/4 of total exports. On February 4, 2025, President Trump slapped a 25% tariff on Mexican imports under emergency powers, rattling long-standing trade ties. Between January and March 2025, U.S. dairy export value lagged the previous year by 0.5%, signaling a stall in demand. In early 2025, cheese exports to Mexico fell by 5% in volume despite global growth trends. That dip marked the first quarterly slide for any major U.S. dairy product in years. The result is clear. Old strongholds are crumbling under diplomatic crossfire and shifting market dynamics. Over the course of 2024, Canada's dairy producers quietly nudged their way into Mexico's market. Canada's exports jumped from $2.86 million to $4.78 million, a roughly 67% year-over-year surge. That sum remains a drop in the bucket next to America's billions. Yet, it underscores how relying on a single tariff-exempt partner can backfire. When policy winds shift, even reliable markets can turn cold. Mexico's pivot reflects deeper concerns over supply chain security and quality standards. Government mandates now favor suppliers with clearer controls and stronger domestic backing. In other words, Mexico is hedging its bets after years of predictable U.S. shipments. No longer can Washington assume unquestioned loyalty from its largest dairy customer. Meanwhile, U.S. producers face the dual threat of shrinking exports and rising production costs. For farmers from Wisconsin to California, that means tighter margins and strategic uncertainty. Analysts warned that sustaining output at current levels will require swift policy responses. From supply chain diversification to targeted trade negotiations, action is urgent. Otherwise, the American dairy industry risks ceding ground to better aligned competitors. The clock is ticking as trade disputes and market dynamics reshape the global dairy landscape. America's advantage is far from guaranteed in this high-stakes game of agricultural geopolitics. If U.S. leadership wanes, partners will fill the void without hesitation. The era of uncontested dairy dominance may be drawing to a close. Music, picking up from America's crumbling market share in Part 1, let's examine why Canada's milk exports keep winning. On January 10, 2025, Canada finalized a national code that requires all dairy herds to be fed on plant-based rations without growth hormones or prolonged antibiotics. That policy rollout set the stage for a new era of agricultural ethics. By mid-April 2025, Canada's ProAction traceability module paired with Dairy Trace and SimplyTrace ensured every animal's history was recorded, linking each drop of exportable milk back to its farm of origin. This system gives importers full confidence in production practices and animal welfare. Meanwhile, as of May 2, 2025, U.S. dairy operations still rely on lot-based tracking with an estimated 80% of added ingredients lacking electronic capture, hampering detailed accountability. That traceability gap leaves American shipments vulnerable to scrutiny. In late June 2025, Mexico publicly declined a U.S. milk consignment for failing to meet the new ethical benchmark set by Canada, marking a rare diplomatic rebuke. That one shipment alone represented millions of dollars in lost sales. Mexico's move underscores how stringent animal care and transparency standards can sway trade decisions. For U.S. producers from Wisconsin to California, the message is clear. High-volume output no longer guarantees market access. Instead, buyers demand proof of ethical sourcing and full supply chain clarity. Analysts warned that without matching Canada's rigorous framework, American dairy will struggle to regain trust. The U.S. dairy industry now faces a stark choice. Either upgrade traceability systems and animal welfare protocols or risk further market losses in key destinations. This pivot highlights a broader shift in global food trade. Transparency and ethics are not optional. They are table stakes. Canada's approach paints a clear blueprint for export success, and it raises a warning for any nation that underestimates the power of supply chain integrity. Building on America's fading export power, Canada's rise reveals an epic clash in dairy diplomacy. Mexico long stood as America's most dependable dairy customer, relying on steady shipments that once fueled its grocery aisles. In the first quarter of this year, overall U.S. dairy shipments fell by 0.7 billion pounds, a sign that higher duties are chilling demand. At the start of January 2025, Canada mandated plant-based rations for dairy herds and banned routine antibiotics and growth hormones. By mid-April, ProAction traceability had gone live, letting importers trace every shipment to individual farms. Last month, Mexico publicly rejected a U.S. milk consignment for ethical shortfalls, a rare diplomatic rebuke. That single decision cost American farmers millions of dollars and signaled a new era where ethical sourcing trumps volume. As recently as late May 2025, Mexican shoppers polled say they will pay more for fully transparent products. Today's young consumers ask not just about price, but about cow feed, pasture access, and hormone use. Canada answers with transparent labels and digital records. U.S. producers, in contrast, still rely on lot-based tracking without individual animal histories, leaving them exposed. The fallout extends from Wisconsin craze to California dairies, where tighter margins and rising costs now threaten operations. Trust has become the new currency in global dairy markets. Swift policy changes are needed if Washington hopes to claw back lost ground. Rural and small-town communities that depend on dairy exports face mounting uncertainty. Policymakers in Washington must now balance domestic political theater with pragmatic trade solutions. Otherwise, Canada's billion-dollar deal with Mexico will stand unchallenged. The battle for dairy dominance has entered a trust war, and America is on notice. This geopolitical dairy drama will echo far beyond North America's fields and boardrooms. Across the U.S., barns are going dark. By mid-2023, the number of licensed dairy farms had quietly fallen to just 26,290. A chilling reminder that America's dairy backbone is splintering, one family farm at a time. Once hailed as the heart of American life, farming is now fading quietly, lost not to scandal, but to silence. Yet, the federal government trailed last with just 30% positive approval. That stark divide underscores why many producers feel left behind. Loan defaults have risen as input costs climbed. Feed, labor, and equipment expenses soared without matching revenue gains. Milk prices remained volatile, swinging with tariff shocks and global trends. Small-scale dairies faced margins drying up faster than parched fields. In contrast, Canadian small dairy operations have held steady for over 15 years. Their price insurance programs and strict production quotas protect both producers and markets. That stability has kept barns full and communities intact north of the border. By comparison, American barns stand empty more often. Investors shun unpredictable yields and mounting debt loads. Farms that once spanned generations now sit abandoned. Mexico's importers notice these gaps in reliability. They increasingly source Canadian milk for its traceability and ethical assurances. U.S. producers risk losing long-standing partnerships. Analysts warned that policy inertia will only deepen the crisis. Without adapting to new frameworks, America's dairy belts may bleed further. Rural towns dependent on dairy revenues face an uncertain future. Washington's trade and agricultural leaders must decide between symbolic gestures and practical solutions. The clock is ticking as livelihoods hang in the balance. For small farmers, this is more than a business downturn. They fear a loss of identity and community as much as income. Continuing our story, Mexico's historic reliance on American milk has begun to waver under growing trade friction. The once steady flow of U.S. dairy now faces uncertainty as costs and regulations pile up. When President Trump rolled out new North American tariffs, that foundation began to shake. Then Washington rolled out hardline trade measures that suddenly rattled once reliable dairy routes. Almost overnight, those higher costs chilled long-standing trade flows. As buyers balked, U.S. export volume slipped, even before dairy products felt the full brunt of retaliatory measures. Meanwhile, across the 49th parallel, Canada tightened its grip. By early 2025, Ottawa prohibited artificial growth hormones and enforced rigorous antibiotic residue testing for all milk destined overseas. Their ProAction traceability program now lets importers trace every jug of milk back to a specific farm. That level of transparency has become a powerful selling point, especially in markets once dominated by the U.S. Trust, it turns out, has its own premium. Back home, the fallout has been brutal for family-owned dairies. Since then, countless small, family-run dairies have fallen silent. Empty barns and shuttered facilities now mark landscapes that once teemed with milk producers. Those closures have hollowed rural communities and siphoned local revenues. Consumers in Mexico aren't just looking at price tags anymore. They want to know how cows are raised, what they eat, and if routine antibiotics were ever administered. Young shoppers especially demand ethical standards, not just low costs. Canada has answered by bolstering its honest label strategy, even selling less volume at higher margins. In contrast, the U.S. still lags with lot-based tracking that can't verify animal-level welfare. The new lesson for Washington is stark. In today's dairy wars, transparency wins. Volume alone no longer secures market share. Producers who fail to match Canada's traceability playbook risk ceding critical ground. For America's dairy sector, the choice is clear. Upgrade ethics and visibility, or watch history repeat itself over and over again. This dairy pact between Mexico and Canada isn't just another contract. It's a clear signal that the game has changed. Once crowned the heart of North American milk, the U.S. now finds itself pushed aside by something no technology upgrade can replace: trust. So, the real question isn't how many gallons America can pump out. It's what story it can tell behind every jug it exports. Will U.S. dairy leaders dare to pause, rethink practices, and rebuild consumer confidence from the ground up? Or will sheer volume be all they have left to compete? What comes next could redefine not just trade deals, but the bond between farmers and families. Which would you pick for your table? A low-cost quart or a pint crafted with respect?